talks. One is how I think about e-Estonia, and some ideas that are maybe a little bit different to the traditional narrative, what Estonians tell themselves, what they tell the world. And then I'm going to think a little bit about what comes next for technology and government, and maybe they'll fit together. So part one, Estonian flag. The whole drama of e-Estonia, it's really the drama of the Estonian state and society for the last 30 years. So, basic story, you've all seen this. Right after the Soviet Union, dirt poor, GDP per capita almost of a developing country, and then things have gone pretty well. Fairly early along, sorry this slide's in Estonia, we did something called the Tiger Leap. We brought internet to every school in the country, back when that was really unusual. By 2000, we put in place something called X-Road, sort of a data platform that we'll talk about. We gave everyone digital identities. And then things happened, like we invented Skype, we started having lots of startups, we digitized all our public services, we had e-voting, and as it all happened, GDP went up and it was all wonderful. It's all, by the way, not an incorrect story, massive oversimplification in a lot of ways. But the two kind of components that get talked about a lot that are sort of considered the core components of digital Estonia, especially the digital public sector, the first is electronic identity. This particular slide is interesting because it's actually no longer up to date. What it shows you is that you could log on to your digital identity using your account at an Estonian bank. And why that's really relevant is people kind of think, okay, e-ID, that's about having this electronic ID card or an app on your phone. That's actually secondary. The really important thing about e-ID and what Estonia did right was that we had an identity, a single identity that then could be used in the digital world. And so actually for a long time, we said, it doesn't really matter technologically how you prove that identity when you're using a service. So we said, okay, banks, you have an account with your bank because everyone's got a bank. And so if the ID card is inconvenient, you don't know how to use it, you can actually log in with the process that your bank has, and then the bank will say, okay, like we know that this Lucas here has this ID number, and the government would rely on that. Didn't really matter technologically. The point was to have a process that was trustworthy, that let you, in the digital world, sort of have some degree of reliability and proof around who you are, and of course then also with the signature signed documents, to replicate the trust relations we have in the physical world, in the digital world. Now this doesn't work anymore because actually the banks prefer you use the eID because it's more secure and it helps them get rid of fraud, and it's cheaper than having their own really secure identity ecosystem. But the point is, one very big foundational block, having digital identity. The other big foundational block is having a way to build services and exchange data across administrative silos. So the sort of the bit that everyone talks about conceptually is something called X-Road. X-Road, it's a whole bunch of things. It's a technology solution, it's some standards, but the idea basically is that any two bodies in Estonia want to exchange data in a secure way, they use this platform. And the value of that is that they don't have to go reinvent the security every time you're building some new digital service. It doesn't, it doesn't get rid of all the legal questions of, do I have a reason to exchange this data? So it's not like everyone's accessing everyone's data. It solves a lot of the technological problems. The same thing's true for identity. We go back to this. The point is it's a technological platform that everyone uses. It has a lot of economics. And when you have those two things solved, then it becomes a lot easier to, in particular, take the relationships and the tasks of the state, which are based on formal legal processes, which have a formal legal status, where you can't just sort of make the risk calculation that I accept that 5% is fraud, and put those into the digital world. Estonia did that very well, and we'll talk about that, but that's kind of the very simplistic story. What's interesting here is, this is again for background, but it's a comparison point. This is the rate of internet adoption. And the labels are a little messy here, but basically these two countries are Germany and Estonia, this is Latvia and Lithuania. The differences aren't important. In fact, the point you should take from this slide is a similarity. Estonia was remarkable in that we, given our level of development in the 90s, we moved faster. We moved at the same speed basically as Germany. But you know what, Latvia and Lithuania just trailed us by 2 years. And if you put the rest of the developed world, the rest of Eastern Europe on this chart, they would all have the same curve. So if we're talking in a very broad sense about use of technology, there's nothing really unique in Estonia. At most, we were faster by a few years than a lot of others, but it all kind of works out in the wash. And yet, if we then go into the question of the state and public services, very large differences remain. So this is a percentage of internet users. So we've already selected out the people who don't use the internet at all. But these days, if we're going to go back to internet users, is more than 90% of the population. The percentage of internet users that in turn use e-government services. In Estonia, it's basically 95%. There are a couple of other countries in Europe that have the same rate: Denmark, Netherlands. Latvia, Lithuania is a bit lower. And then Germany here, it's like 60%. So there are, unlike the overall usage of the internet, when it comes to the public sector, there are much bigger differences. And to the Germans, I'm sorry that you're going to feel picked on, but because I'm writing this paper about Germany, there are going to be a lot of examples about Germany, and they're not favorable to Germany. And then it's even more interesting when we look at numbers, usage rate, right? Because it's not just like, do you have the thing? It's what do you actually do with the thing? So there's a lot of numbers I'm going to help you interpret this. These are transaction volumes and usage rate for electronic identity. So let's start actually at the bottom. It's the percentage of the population that actually uses their EID for services, public or private. In Estonia, it's 90% of the population. In Germany, it's 9%. Doesn't mean that the Germans aren't using services, but it means they're using password, email address type combinations. They're not using a secure infrastructure, which is exposing them to a lot of identity theft and fraud. And then interestingly, once we look at those people, what's the volume? So the million people in Estonia using EID, they're giving 130 million digital signatures a year, and they're authenticating themselves 360 million times. That just means they're using this EID for everything all the time. The small number of Germans, it's about 4 million that has the German Digitalausweis, they're authenticating themselves 14 million times. So even if you have the infrastructure and everyone uses it, there's a big difference in how much they really use it. And that's just like because when you read about these things, oh, they have this, they don't, it's good, it's not. You actually have to look into well, what's actually being done with it. This is my favorite visualization, my favorite organogram of the state. This is what 10 years ago a British colleague of mine called the state as a data model. It's a visualization of data queries over X road, and all these different nodes are different authorities and institutions, mostly public authorities, but also a lot of private sector bodies. Again, the detail's not so important, and you can look this up, and you can it's open source data, you can play with it, but it's a very different way of looking at who's doing what, how are services set up, what's the hierarchy of the state, instead of the usual structure there's these ministries or these agencies. This is ministries, it's agencies, but it's based on who's exchanging data with whom. And I said, adoption rate is what matters. So this is where, now we're getting into what makes e-Estonia interesting and why it's still an object of study. It's stuff like this, it's the adoption rate, and the adoption rate happened really quickly. So this is a percent of people using the online tax declaration system. And this is a pretty typical adoption curve. It's kind of what's called an S-curve, which is you have initially it's slow, then you have a period of steep uptake, and then it kind of reaches an asymptote. What I think is interesting here is most countries roll out e-tax platforms here. And by then, we were at 90% adoption. So that is the part where we went faster. There's one service in the world where pretty much every other country in the world has a 0% usage rate, and we have about a 50% adoption rate, and that's online voting. Everything else that we've done, every other thing we've done is not unique anymore. And you can find another country somewhere that's done it. The one thing that no one else has done is putting elections online. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is it's a pretty crazy thing to do, and you have to be really sure of yourself that you're going to do it, and people are pretty conservative in general when it comes to how they do elections. And probably if we had the discussion today, should we do online voting, and we weren't doing it today, we might not. But this started, 20 years ago. It was a more innocent age. And as you see, at first it was something for the nerds to fiddle with. The first really 10 years, especially the first 5 years, it's a very small portion of the population that used it. But now in the most recent elections, it's more than 50% of Estonians voting online. And you ask what's the practical value? For most Estonians, it's actually pretty low, because elections are well organized here. Also for IT reasons, but not having to do with the online voting. Today in Estonia, if we have elections, you can go vote anywhere in the country. Because basically they have a system set up where they'll take the ballot and count it in the right place, even if it's a local election. But it's really important for two reasons. First of all, there are groups that get an access benefit from it. The biggest group that gets an access benefit is Estonians abroad. Estonia, a very small country, we have about 40 countries where there's an Estonian embassy or consulate. The record we have is Estonians voting in 140 countries during the online election. So there's a lot of people who would not be participating in the democratic life of the country, but for the online voting. And it's not just what countries do we have a consulate? I mean, we have an embassy in Canberra, but that's not very helpful to you if you're in Sydney or Adelaide, or Australia is a really big country, right? And lots of examples like that. And it is actually cheaper. It's not really a reason to do it. It's not like massively cheaper than a regular vote. It is cheaper than the sort of all the remote voting options. But everything else that we do is cool. If it's better today, it's better because of the adoption rates or the level of penetration, not necessarily the fact that we do it. So this is kind of the thing that all the Estonians worry about, like, are we still the best in the world? And we're still pretty good. We're still pretty good. I will say, rankings are a really messy thing because you also have to look into the data and the methodology. So I'll give you an example of this. There's the first two rows here. The first row is the UN e-government development index. And you think, okay, so that's going to tell you how good a country is at e-government. Now the first row, however, combines three things. Quality of digital public services, quality of infrastructure, which is like, do you have good 5G, do you have good fiber, and education. And by the way, the education thing doesn't even measure digital skills. It's basically like how many people do you have getting university degrees. So then the thing that actually measures digital public services is a subscore called service provision. And so for instance, Germany, like if you take the overall thing, it's a pretty high ranking, and that's for two reasons. One is they've actually done a really good job on 5G rollout, so kudos to the German Bundesnetzagentur, like Germans can get their shit together. And of course, it's a highly educated country, so like Germany on the education thing looks a lot better than Nigeria. But if you then look at like how good are their digital public services, they're not ranked quite as high. And this subscore is pretty good because they actually go and they look at the services. Like a lot of rankings will do a kind of lazy desk research option of, let's look at what their national strategy says, and do they have a strategy for this and that, and what do the documents say? So that's really good for big countries. Big countries create documents. They have big bureaucracies that create documents. And so you'll find rankings where like Italy's ranked best in the world, or like in the top 3 in the world for this or that digital thing. And then you ask, well, what are they measuring? They're like, well, Italy has a strategy for all these things. And by the way, it really hurts small countries because we don't have the people to go write strategies for everything. Maybe with ChatGPT now we can have them create bullshit documents. But like this, so these are rankings that actually they mostly look at like what's actually going on. What are the actual services like? The UN one, they actually have a whole list of services and they go and they try and use them and they rank them. So that's pretty good. I want to point out the last row, which is really interesting, which is internet freedom. Because I mean, the point is we're not just talking about the big bad state building a Leviathan. There are some non-democratic countries that have good digital public services, but they use that as a panopticon and a form of control. We're also pretty good at the freedom thing. Iceland, we in Iceland trade places for #1 there. But the real question you should be asking if you're not in this space is, so what? Who gives a fuck? You know what? Good for you, Estonia, Like people get to save some time and they don't have to stand in line, and that's really nice. But does it really matter? And in fact, we've been doing this digital washing for a while. The German speakers read the thing on the left. I'll translate it for everyone else. It's no surprise that Estonia has become a state that in the use of the internet, and this was 20 years ago, so everyone's like talking about mobile data, and using mobile data is further than the old countries of the EU, and this is what's in the quote, in the parentheses, and gladly tells everyone about it. 22 years ago. And these are a whole bunch of articles, all of them from 2002, talking about Estonia is so fancy and they're doing all this digital government stuff. So not only have we been doing digital government for 25 years, we've been telling everyone. That's nice, but you know what? Back in the 1980s, there was a thing called Minitel. France, nice historical footnote. France rolled out a terminal that lets you do e-commerce, look up the news, chat, send emails, that was used by like a third of French households. Back when there was no the World Wide Web existed, but it was used by a couple of academics. The PC was didn't exist, and everyone's like, oh my God, the French are gonna own this digital revolution, and so cool, and then that didn't happen. So just having cool technology isn't enough. And so kind of in the next bit, I want to talk a little bit about how the technology is related to the broader questions of governance. And I'm going to warn you that there's going to be a lot of correlation with a little ambiguity about causation. And I'm going to get to the causation question at the end, but so if you're asking, like, wait a minute, just because they're good at this doesn't mean it's because it's digital, that's a very good question. Hold that thought. So we're going to start off with this sort of baseline number, which is a public expenditure as a percentage of GDP. You know, Estonia, but also Latvia, Lithuania, we have thinner states than in Western Europe. In particular, the overhead for general administration is lower than it is in a lot of old European countries. Not low anymore by global standards. You go to Africa, Southeast Asia, those numbers are lower, but still a fairly compact state. And what I'm going to give you a bunch of different numbers from different areas is, in spite of that, very good performance, part of which is digital. I'm just going to run through a bunch of numbers. These specific numbers aren't that important. It's to give you a sense of a trend. So for instance, taxation. Taxation is great, by the way, because it's the one area of government where you really have numbers end to end. The OECD ranks or measures, a lot of things, but they measure, among other things, how much does it cost a country to collect 100 euros of tax revenue? And the numbers are this gap is pretty big. It costs the Estonian government 20 cents to collect 100 euros of tax revenue. It costs the German tax administration €1.30. So basically 6.5 times more. And in fact, if you then consider that taxation is higher, that's even worse. It's, the per capita thing is even higher. And this is not all digital, right? Some of that is having a really simple tax code and a certain culture of compliance. But the digitization really helps because it makes a lot of this work happen in the background. It means that the number of people working at the tax authority, not just in an absolute sense, but a per capita sense, is much smaller. And if we look through the history of how Estonia got to that, being best in the OECD, 15, 20 years ago, we were not. We were below average. And it was a lot of the digital reforms and the data use that actually let us get there. So the same thing, we can look at business environment. Again, a bunch of numbers here, but basically, the short takeaway is it's pretty easy to start a company in Estonia. The court system is really efficient. This measures how long it takes to resolve a court case. Estonia is over here next to Denmark, which is always in anything, by the way, Denmark is always the best governed country in the world. Estonia, we're after them. We're going to get the damn Danes, but it's hard. They're really good. So if you want an example of really good governance, the Danes will usually beat us, but they usually do that by just throwing massive amounts of money at us. We've done things cheap. By the way, Germany here, there's no data call, because German federalism is so screwed up, they don't know how long it takes them to resolve court cases. But these are all input variables. How about an output variable? Transaction costs. So these numbers measure the percentage of the value of a bit of real estate to do the end-to-end cycle of buying a piece of property, doing everything then, and at the end of the day, selling it. So from one owner to the next owner, the complete cycle. What percentage of the value of that property goes into the notaries, the fees, whatever? And there's a range because it's a little hard to measure and it varies depending on the value of the property, but these ranges speak for themselves. In Estonia, it's say on average 3-point-something% of the value of the property. In Germany, it's 12%. And again, Germany's not the worst. There are ones where it's worse, but it's pretty bad. And you ask, how do we get there? It's not all because of digital, right? Simple legal environment, some efficiencies here and there, but the fact that it's automated and the fact that we just talked about how easy the taxation is, how a bunch of these things happen in the background, that helps a lot. Or we can take another kind of one of these complex measures. This is a new World Bank index, and I don't, because it's brand new and they came up with a new methodology, and this year they've only ranked 50 countries, which Estonia was in it, but say most of Europe wasn't. I'm not yet confident about the methodology, but they did a thing, and this is looking very specifically at the question of how do things like how the state works affect business. The quality of public services is not all public services, but the specific quality of those public services that matter if you're running a business. Particular regulatory authorities, a business register, tax, and so on. Estonia, according to this, best in the world. Or operational efficiency, which is measuring how efficiently can you as a private sector company operate given the legal and business environment, fourth in the world. It's not bad, right? So, and again, it's not just digital, but that's part of it. And by the way, I'm going to point out here, like there's some countries you wouldn't expect to see here that are pretty good. So like Greece has put a serious effort into improving their quality in the last couple of years. And then there's some obvious ones. You know, Singapore is at the top of the rankings, no surprise. Hong Kong's still pretty good, but not as good as it used to be. Stuff like that. Enough about business. Let's talk about something like healthcare. Healthcare is interesting because I'm not going to tell you that Estonia has the best healthcare system in the world. And the reason is actually very simple. It's the first column there. Estonia, like Latvia and Lithuania, we spend a lot less on healthcare than, say, Germany does. And some of that goes into the fact that Germany then can spend a lot more money on really advanced cancer drugs and really expensive things. But a good part of that also goes into the second column, which is administrative procedures. So Germany, with its already higher percentage of GDP to healthcare, is spending 4.4% on admin costs. We're spending 1.5%. Lithuanians, which have a very similar e-health system, 1.4%. What's interesting, these last three columns, so this is kind of an overall index of the quality of the healthcare system. And Germany's in 12th place in Europe. It's pretty good. Like the countries in front of them are all kind of wealthy Western European countries. The first remarkable thing is that Estonia is like right at their sort of heels. But then there's a couple of sub-measures that don't look at the question of like how much money do you spend, but are asking the non-material things of like how well is the system performing? What are waiting times? What's the information access like? And there Estonia does really well. It's kind of a place, you know, we can dive into all sorts of examples where like, given the baseline of less spending in something where money really matters, Estonia gets great outcomes. Is it only because of digital or other stuff? Hard to say, but it's clearly a part of it. Or emergency services. I mean, these numbers are all pretty good, but still, in Estonia, it takes 5 seconds for a call to the police and the fire department to be answered. In Germany, it's 9 seconds on average. But the real interesting thing is the second row. It's that Estonia has like combined all of its data to the point where there's one physical room that all emergency services dispatch gets done from. And that's on land, in the air, on sea, no geographical division, because it basically says, let's have all the data flow together and we can be really effective on this. And even like, you know, Latvia and Lithuania, that are pretty efficient, they still have it split up in various ways. Germany is 232. Now, that's not because Germany is like technologically inept, that's because of federalism and institutional arrangements. So like you can't always say that the efficiencies are because of technology, but these things play into each other. Or another area where I will not claim that technology has caused us to perform well per se is education. So these first two lines are interesting. They're kind of proxy indicators for the level of digitization in schools. And the specific thing that this measure looked at, and these are the numbers from a few years before COVID, was in primary schools and upper secondary schools, the percentage of schools that had a virtual learning environment. So that's not, it's more than a connection to the internet. It's like, do you have a software suite where you're managing how the school is run? I am not going to tell you that having a virtual learning environment explains why Estonia has higher PISA scores. However, there actually is a study done by the University of Tartu over a number of years that looked at a bunch of schools and in a qualitative way said, look, actually, if we look at these learning environments and we look at what they do for instruction, and the secondary effect of more transparency, more teacher, parent, student engagement, yeah, they do actually lead to better outcomes. So, like, the causal arrow, messy, and you might also say, actually, you know, because we have this great school system, we use the technology, but there's a relationship there, it's worth unteasing. And something I think does help, for instance, is like Estonia is a very decentralized school system, by the way. I know that the minister just told you about all the ways in which they've done a big centralized reform, but the reality of the school system in Estonia is it's one of the most decentralized in the world. Basically, it's the director of the school that has control over just about everything. So for instance, we don't have a standardized digital skills curriculum for all schools in Estonia. Every school does it its own way. But what we do have is a lot of data. And we do make everyone make the data available. And this creates this really interesting transparency. You can look at this, it's a great website, where you can look at all the data from all the schools and you can look at the relationships, and that data is used even in a very decentralized system to put performance pressure on everyone. So like it's one of the ways in which this technology and data infrastructure pushes you to better services. Or let's look at like open data. We're talking about data. Estonia is pretty good at making data available. Open data is kind of a messy thing because like most of this measures is like, do you have data sets that the public sector has that are made available because a lot of the quality questions are very qualitative, it's hard to do that. But let's apply this to a specific use case, procurement. So the first two rows are kind of measures of how transparent are countries with putting their procurement data online. The last one is interesting. This is an EU measure. It's the value of procurements as a percentage of GDP that are registered on a sort of EU portal. And that, what that's telling you is that the country is digitizing its procurements, it's making them visible in a standardized format that can end up in this EU portal. Estonia and Lithuania are basically, it's the same number, 10% of their GDP, which is basically all of their public procurements are on this portal. And that means that things are fairly transparent, there's some competition going on. In Germany, it's 2% of GDP. Now the federal government, by the way, in Germany is quite good. The problem is that most procurement in Germany is done on the state level, and they're not there, and so all these traditional sort of networks of insiders and outsiders, it helps perpetuate that, and means underperformance of the public sector. So I've thrown this all of you kind of a deluge of information. You're probably lost in the numbers. I'm going to wrap this together with two final slides. The first one kind of sums it all up in a very simple number, which is user satisfaction. Ask people, are you happy with the services that your state provides? Different, the OECD asks this, the EU asks this, the questions are slightly different. And generally, Estonians are pretty happy with the services. And this is, in this OECD one, number one is Luxembourg. So we're pretty happy. Luxembourg is a GDP per capita of a shit ton of money. And we don't have quite as much. And way above average. And the same thing is true for the EU numbers. Although interestingly enough, for whatever reason, the second question, the average respondent was a lot grumpier than for the first one. And this is kind of a nice proxy indicator. And the second one, this is to pull it all together, to look at these very sort of big picture governance indicators. So the Berggruen Index, these are basically, they look at the same thing. One's a sort of foundation, the other one's a World Bank. They try and look at all these sort of large indicators of state capacity, all your indices on level of internal conflict, law of order, etc., public goods provision, inputs, outputs, accountability, democracy scores. Basically, there isn't a single sort of large political science database that isn't somehow aggregated into this. And these are some interesting macro trends. What you see is that we've got Germany here, but actually if you took the OECD EU average, it's a similar trend line. The collective West is slowly degrading on a lot of these things. And Estonia, but also Latin, Lithuania, and Central and Eastern Europe have been shooting up. And so there's an interesting question is it a story of convergence? Is it one of overtaking? And of course we come back to the question that we were asking previously, what role does tech play in this? And I just want to say very clearly, I am not going to argue for a simple causal explanation Estonia was a regular Central Eastern European former Soviet country, then came digital, as a result Estonia performs better. Or Estonia is better at tech than Germany, therefore Estonia better governance outcomes. On the other hand, I will also say, partially based on the data, but partially from having been in this for many, many years, the other version of this, which is, Estonia, the digital stuff is just an epiphenomenon, a dependent variable of being really good at governance. That's not there either. The technology at a lot of key stages has let us provide services in a way that's more efficient, more effective, more transparent, and creates a feedback loop. And I think it's important that we talk, when we talk about digital, we be clear about what we're talking about. It's not just technology. This is a definition that some British colleagues of mine came up with, which is, when they say digital, they mean applying the culture, the practices, and the processes and technologies of the internet era to respond to people's expectations. Because if we look at how technology has changed in a general sense, how organizations work, it's been a massive shift in the last generation. And this brings me to Ukraine. So the Ukraine story is really interesting. 2019, President Zelensky, he ran for office calling for a state and a smartphone. And he basically told his digital minister, whom we'll talk about in a second, when he was elected, I want you to do what the Estonians did. Just go copy them. And in some ways they did. So the e-Governance Academy has been in Ukraine now for more or less a decade. They took a data exchange platform, which they call Trambita, which is sort of a Ukrainian horn, so it's kind of like a communications and a signaling device. It's based on a version of X-Road. It's done by a private company from Estonia. They copied the legislation for EID and a lot of the kind of specific reforms, say in justice or in healthcare, they patterned on Estonia. But they also did some other stuff. The digital minister I mentioned, this guy does not look like a normal minister. He was a social media marketing guy who ran social media marketing for President Zelensky's campaign. And he became the digital minister. And so he had like a very different approach to like how you do services and communicate with citizens, which is like the marketing is really important because we have to get people to like want to use our products and services. And then he still goes around in a t-shirt, which is, I didn't do that when I was, in government. And the results, by the way, are pretty good, which is on that sort of same online service index, which measures the actual quality of the services that people use, Ukraine is now 5th in the world. It's also very interesting that Saudi Arabia is there, but we can talk about that separately. We see this sort of startup-like thinking in what they've done in defense and drones. So if anyone's following the conflict, basically Ukraine has reinvented modern warfare in the last 2 years. A lot of it's been that same team of people. It's a team, as I said, that's actually like a lot of the cool stuff they've done has been done by a bunch of people who came from outside of government. And so they brought in the culture and the processes and the way of thinking that you'd have in a startup in a B2C tech company. To the point where one of the things they've actually done, I'd say better than us, is they've figured out how the sort of user experience paradigm has changed. And they came out with a state super app called Dia before Estonia did. So one of the projects we worked on was sort of working together with the Ukrainians and learning from their experience. So we got to the point where within a few years, Estonia had some things to learn from Ukraine. I also want to say very clearly there that, because people ask me a fair bit, so does this mean that Ukrainians are better than us Estonians? And the answer is like, it's a mixed one. Because they have this team and this island of excellence. It's really incredible. But so far it's one administration, one time, surrounded by a lot of difficulties and challenges. And the question is, how do you make that stick and sort of progressively develop and then lead to the same governance outcomes? And this is sort of where I think the gap between Ukraine and Estonia is still huge, which is we've turned all these technology, we've turned our use of technology into a contribution to the governance outcomes. And well, let's just say governance outcomes in Ukraine is a messy topic right now. I'm going to keep on going with the fire hydrant, because the real question is what comes next. All this is cool, but what's happened is that there's been a body of practice that's developed, and sort of at this point there's maybe 10 to 20 countries in the world that are all more or less equivalently good. So Denmark, I said, more or less neck and neck with us. You ask how are we better than New Zealand or Finland or whatever, and I could say the ways in which we're better, and if I had to make the marketing argument I could, but we're basically all working on the same stuff. And what we're working on right now is we're working on making the services more user-centric, using data for our decisions, changing a bit how the operational model of government changes and how we work. But there's a whole lot of bottlenecks. I'm not going to run through all this, but just a lot of how government works and thinks gets in the way of doing technology well. And the really depressing thing is that most of this has not changed in 10 years. I could have put this slide up 10 years ago. What's changed is more countries have gotten to this, and they've gotten through the kind of the elementary stuff of they've figured out identity, they've figured out data, they have some good services, they've got more people using them. But basically we're all stuck here. We're stuck with these bottlenecks and we haven't broken through them for 10 years. Which is kind of interesting because it's not about technology, it's about the processes and the culture and the legal framework and the politics of the state. And so I'm going to suggest 2 tracks in which I think this can change and where this agenda of digital government is going in the next couple of years. And the first track is it's a boring track. Better management and maturity. Just sort of iteratively everyone slowly getting better at this. This is kind of a mapping of, this is 10 years old by the way, it's done by McKinsey, a mapping of how digitally transformed sectors operate. It's still pretty more or less accurate. A couple of these sectors moved up, but what you'll see is upward a couple sectors, super digital. And then we've got a bunch of areas that really suck at digitization. Education, government, healthcare, transportation. Government's one of them, but also transportation, healthcare. These are all areas that are heavily regulated, have a lot of public services. If we want a more quantitative look at this next number is specific to the UK, but it sort of is indicative of a lot of the rich world, which is technology has led to massive increases in productivity in the private sector. And governments basically kind of sat in place. You know, Estonia probably has had some productivity increases, but even in Estonia, private sector productivity growth has exceeded public sector productivity growth. Or we can look at, you know, a sector that's highly governmental, which is healthcare. You know, you hear about how technology makes everything cheaper and better, and yet it hasn't fixed healthcare. In fact, healthcare keeps getting more and more expensive. So there are people thinking about, you know, what comes next in this paradigm. And one view is that we were entering what's called the post-digital era. And I appreciate the honesty of Gartner is a company that does a lot of sort of analysis for IT companies. They just call it the post-digital era, which is kind of vapid. And like, if anyone ever wants, you know, proposes to a paper that has post-digital in the title, run away from it, it means nothing. But basically what they're kind of saying is like, nothing's really going to change. We have to get progressively better at managing things, and there's like, it's a slow process of change and culture shift and so on. That's true to some extent. You know, Estonia is actually like doing a lot of this. We had this sort of overall framework for strategic planning, a strategic document called Estonia 2035. It's actually pretty cool. Like, we quantify most of the stuff. We've got these measures. This is all, you can, you know, like, this is sort of, again, the macro indicators. But then you kind of, all the things, like the different elements of government tie into that. So this is, I apologize, this is one of my few slides in Estonian. What this slide shows you basically is how, in the case of internal security, like they start with the black thing, which is the internal security strategy, which is actually then in turn about how they fit into the overall national strategy. And we go from there down to planning individual services. And like the individual KPIs of the services are ultimately connected to these very big, you know, long-term national goals of healthy people, safe environment, stuff like that. And like technology fits into that, and that's all kind of getting better at doing the job of government. This is what the Danes do really fucking well. There's another kind of version of this, which some people in your institute are working on, and the framing they use is personal government. So the idea is that, you know, we've had e-government, which was about sort of taking the traditional model of services, digitizing it, and then thinking through digitization changes. And now we're kind of going to this era of like thinking through what people need. And again, Estonia is doing some of this. One of the things we're doing is something called life events. And the idea of a life event is the organogram of the state, the traditional organogram of this agency and that ministry and so on, doesn't fit together with what life looks like. Because in reality, things happen to people. You have a child, you start a business, but also shitty stuff, you know? You have someone die. Or your relative dies, because if you're dead, you don't worry about the e-services anymore. And we have to figure out a way to get the state to support that. So this is an example of that. It's actually really hard. It's easy to say that. It's a really hard process. Sorry, in Estonian, this is a mapping of all the different public services that are related to having a child. And the point here is that there's a whole lot of them, and the color code was the green ones were the services that when we did the mapping, we said, okay, if we try and view the process of having a child, and you all are too young to worry about this, mostly, but this will happen, right? Like, what do we have to change to have it fit together as one process? And those are the green ones. The ones that are green, we didn't have to change, but the orange and the red were things that have to be redesigned and re-engineered. So you start with something simple, which is like, how do we make it easy for all the things the government does around having a kid? You know, the health care, the registering of the child, the money that we pay the mother when she's on maternity leave, registering for a school. How do we have that happen all in one thing? It's actually a really hard re-engineering job. Skip this slide. And this is a nice way of thinking about things, but it's incomplete. Because of course, government doesn't just provide services. Government deals with all sorts of risks and crises. It's the insurer of last resort. It's a regulator. And so I would say that the existing agenda on what's happening in digital government is kind of boring and a little slow, and really doesn't matter, because a thing is happening now that is as big as the internet and the PC 30 years ago, which is AI. AI is not new. The term was coined in 1956, but I tend to agree with Mark Andreessen on the kind of the people go around sort of telling you why AI will change everything. It really will change everything. This is, by the way, a really good essay. Google it, read it in your free time, not right now. The reason that AI is going to change everything and is doing it right now, is Moore's law. Some of you may know about Moore's law. The version you've probably seen is this. So Moore's law, the version that's usually presented is that every 18 or so months, the speed of processors doubles. And so basically the point is that computers get faster and faster and faster. And it's not a linear change, it's an exponential growth. Of course, look at the curve on the left. But this is actually a misstatement of Moore's law, and it misses really the powerful point, which is actually, it was an economic argument. It was the cost per transistor declines at an exponential rate. And so the real articulation is this is a graph of how much a transistor has cost over time. And why that cost bit is really important is because it's not about Moore as a theoretical argument, with one O, not two, sorry. It's not about quantity as a theoretical argument. It's a practical question of with a given amount of resources, what quantity can you get? And what AI has done is we've gotten to this point where we have so much data and so much processing capacity that we can start doing, we now can create these LLMs that do all the things that ChatGPT does. The algorithms, the technology, the theoretical thinking, a lot of that, it's not that new. It was around in the 80s and the 90s. Okay, there's been some clever innovations on top of that, but like the Nobel Prizes that were given out a week ago, they were for work done in the 80s and 90s. But now we've got the data and the processing power. That suddenly, we've got AI models that they were just working toward getting to human baseline, and suddenly it's past human capabilities on a lot of specific measures. On the right, we've got a graph of test scores by GPT 3.5 and then by GPT 4. So like these leaps, like in a couple of years again, suddenly doing better than people at a lot of tasks. And also really getting adopted quickly. This is the amount of time it takes an application to get to 1 million users. It took 5 days from ChatGPT being launched to having 1 million users. And this is going to change a lot of sectors and a lot of industries. And particularly, it's going to change some of those same sectors and some of those same areas that have been really hard to digitize so long. So that's all the hype. I want to give you a couple of conceptual tools to think about AI. First of all, 3 ideas to wrap your head around. The first is the difference between point solutions versus system solutions. And by the way, there's a meta idea, which is that there's a lot of lessons from the previous industrial revolutions that you need to look at now. So these are all observations that people had from electrification and from steam 100, 150 years ago. Economic history, very useful, very important. So when electricity came, the first thing people did in factories is said, okay, can we hook the existing machine that was previously connected to a crankshaft, because a pre-electric factory was a big steam engine, and then everything was connected to that. And so the first thought was, okay, instead of connecting everything to the big steam engine, let's connect everything to electric power. And it'll be cleaner, and it'll be a little more efficient in some ways. But it's interesting when you start thinking about the fact that now you don't have to have a metal crankshaft connecting yourself to an engine. You can actually reconfigure the factory. You can have different kinds of workstations, and you can physically set a factory up. There's a reason that the factories of the industrial era were tall buildings, and if you now look at any modern factory, it's a flat building spread out. And so once you realize that the technology lets you set up your systems in a different way, you can organize things in a different way. It takes a while, though, for people to learn how to do that. So we've had a lot of use of AI in very specific applications. Let's do AI for translation, or let's do AI for image detecting. We're now starting to get into the question of what happens if we redesign the systems to take account of AI. And this gets to the second line, which is when you're thinking about what value is it giving me, this is a very simple heuristic. People, for any new technology, people are like, it's better, faster, and cheaper. The important thing here is you actually have to look at all 3. And on AI, you look at most of what people are talking about, and they're really looking at cheaper. They're saying, oh my, ChatGPT, LLMs can do all these things faster, or cheaper than humans can, and what does that mean? But it's also a better and a faster question. There are types of analysis that the AI can do better. Tedious analysis or huge amounts of data that a human brain can't wrap their head around, and it's faster. It's available 24/7. And so if you're thinking about, well, how is this going to change something, you have to ask not just, oh, it's cheaper, but how do better, faster, cheaper interact with each other? And now you're thinking, oh, shit. Because all this put together means, what the fuck am I going to do with a political science degree? Again, let's go back to sorry, these are all the things, technical IT, but these are all the things you're qualified for, right? You're not going to have a job. Except, this is Jevons paradox. Jevons paradox, it's not a law, it's an observation, is that technologies that create an increase in efficiency often tend not to reduce the demand for the underlying resource, but increase the demand. Very simple example, you build a new freeway, wider, it does not suddenly mean that there's less traffic. There's more traffic because you induce a lot of new demand. Or, when there were massive increases in the efficiency of coal-burning engines for ships in the sort of late 19th century, that did not decrease the demand for coal. No. Suddenly people are like, wow, there are all these things we can now build steamships for, these new applications, smaller steamships, bigger steamships, and the demand for coal from the shipping industry shot up, and of course no one used sails anymore. So, paradoxically, it may be the case that all of this automation actually makes some of these cognitive tasks being higher demand. I'll give you a really simplistic example. Notebook LM, which is this very cool research tool by Google, which if you're not using, you should all use it. Google it, Notebook LM. Notebook LM has this very cool new feature where it will take a body of text and it will make a podcast out of it. So like, you're writing a research paper and you want to kind of interact with all the source material. You literally upload all the PDFs, you press a button, it takes a few minutes to do it. There's a podcast, and the podcast will be like two voices talking about the material. The first thought is, oh shit, podcasters are all going to be unemployed. But actually, what's going on in the background is that basically conversational AI is creating a revolution or a change in how we interact with content, and basically people are doing a lot more voice interaction, a lot less reading, a lot less visual consumption, or at least of static visual materials. And so, you know, what a lot of the people have thought about this is actually what's going to happen is we're going to move to a world where just a lot more of our media consumption is conversational and is these things, you know, is sort of talks and so on. And then paradoxically, it may actually lead to more human podcasting alongside these computer-generated podcasts. No one knows, this is all speculative, but you shouldn't just make the simplistic assumption that because the computer is good at this, that like the humans don't have a role. Or let's do something like automation of legal services. Like qualified lawyers are super expensive and a massive bottleneck. And so we talk about access to justice. The problem is like they just, you know, if you have a huge amount of money, you can hire an amazing lawyer and a legal team to work through all these documents, to do legal discovery and prepare a court case. If you're a simple human being, you know, in a whatever dispute, it's hopeless. Now, what if 90% of that labor is suddenly done by GPT? That doesn't mean, you know, we're not going to have a static demand for legal resources. It suddenly is going to mean that a lot of cases where you previously just wouldn't have had a lawyer, you'll have access to that. It may be that we actually need more human beings as part of that system than we needed before. So this is the first conceptual thing. The second one, I'm not going to go through all of this, but I just want to make the meta point. There are these different attempts to systematize levels of autonomy. The first one is actually the easiest to think about. It's pretty standardized. It's levels of autonomy for self-driving cars. So the first thing is like driver assistance. So basically, you know, it's sort of like your adaptive cruise control, and then at the bottom you've got full automation where you can go to sleep or you can, you know, watch a movie while the car's driving. I should say, really bad, a lot of people watch movies, cars aren't quite that automated, but hey. And then there are like other systems for doing this for different things. And I just want to say, like, there are these systems people are thinking about sort of like, how do you try and categorize what the AI is doing? And the last thing there's a very specific thought I want to put out here, which is that one of the things generative AI does, it's not about new things with AI, it's about making a lot of the things that we've previously been doing in the digital era a lot more accessible. So some of the most common uses for ChatGPT, writing computer code, analyzing data, doing visual design. These are all previously highly specialized tasks that basically small numbers of people engaged in. And now, someone who doesn't have a background can actually get their hands dirty. So, dear political science students who do not have a bachelor's degree in computer science, in statistical analysis, in design, you have no excuse. You have a big data set. And I was a bachelor's student in political science. Like, you read all these, like, you know, all this amazing data set with 1 million data points. You're like, okay, but can I please find the journal article that, like, digests this for me? Because I'm not going to go and, like, every time load this into Stata or SPSS and do the analysis. Well, you know what? You can now load it at ChatGPT. First, you can ask, what questions should I ask of the data? And then you can have it ask the questions. And you actually start playing with this data. And it is 100 times easier than it used to be. So what it means is that people who, like, previously, like, there was a skills gap, or like it wasn't like an impermeable skills gap. Like if you're doing your master's thesis, you're working with this one data set, you'll go work with it for that. But you wouldn't go play with a data set for like your class reading for like Friday. Why not now? So I've been using this, and it's like, as someone who doesn't, like, perceives that same barrier, it's amazing. Like, I'm doing stuff with data, or like writing scripts, where like previously someone was like, well, this is complicated, and I don't have the time, and maybe someone else can do it. And so it changes like a lot of the dynamics around using these tools, and that's not a new phenomenon. So Web 2.0, kind of what's happened in the last 10, 15 years, a lot of that was not new ideas. It was what people talked about in the 90s, but no one executed on. Because in the 90s, it was like, we're gonna have the information superhighway, it's gonna change everything, but then it was like actually a really crappy, Windows 95, shitty browser, dial-up connection, and it took a while for the like tech to catch up with the theory. And I think that's the same thing's gonna happen, that a lot of what happens now that's really impressive isn't going to be doing totally new things, but it's going to be the quantitative effect of something going from being done by 5% of people to being done by 50% of people. So I'm going to conclude with a couple of thoughts on what this might mean for government. I'm going to skip this stuff right now. Right now what everyone's doing, this is pre-ChatGPT, pre-GenAI, is like point solutions, individual use cases. Estonia's done a bunch of these. We like to say we have 140 use cases of AI. They're all very good and they're all very cool. They're not revolutionary. The first thing that's a bit more revolutionary is a new form of UI, so a new form of user interface. Nothing unusual in, you've got this in all your private sector services, but instead of interacting with a service through a browser, through text, you have a conversation. It could be like a, fairly simple conversation, like, hey, what's the law on this? Or hey, I want to, I need to get a new passport. What's interesting about the conversational bit is it may no longer feel like you're interacting with a digital service. You can have a conversation with a conversational AI over the phone. So people who would not, even the 5% in Estonia that might be excluded from using digital services, they can now start interacting with those services. The second thing, of course, is what happens in government when everyone can do digital. When it's no longer like the IT agency and the small percentage of civil servants that can build new services and work with data. You can start building new services really quickly. You can do a lot more data-driven decision-making. Because the reality is, like, people talk about data-driven decision-making, but then they still do this and decide in a very simplistic manner because it's hard to do right now. And then you get into some interesting questions. And this is speculative, but I think that the process of onboarding people and cultural transfer, building cultures, is going to get a lot faster for a couple of reasons I'll talk about in a sec. And that will make a lot of the kind of mechanics of how you do things in government, or in organizations in general, and big organizations, happen faster. Then we get to the next level, which is new UX. UX is different from UI, because UX is more broadly user experience, the whole kind of the broader concept of how a person interacts with the service. So there's a whole bunch of things that we can start automating. Design processes, integrating feedback, personalizing services to individual needs, things like quality control, or detection of discrimination or incorrect behavior. So, people talk a lot about the risks to ethics and rights from AI, but let's also talk about the risks from people, right? Human beings are discriminatory assholes. In principle, we look at the data, we can detect a lot of that. Well, the AI can do that a lot faster. It can do it while a service is being developed and say, hey, I'm looking at this service interaction, and this person who is of a different skin color and from a different region, is getting a different sort of behavior from the civil servant. And my initiative is, dear civil servant, make sure you're treating this person the same way. So you can start building these things into your processes. And that changes what it means to provide a public service. This is still within the basic logic of government. And now things get interesting with something that everyone now in the AI world is working on, which is agents. What is an agent? The idea of an agent is it's an AI that is interacting with the world independently. So it's not just giving you inputs, it's not an assistant, it's kind of got the authority to go off and do things itself. And I think there are two kinds of agents that are interesting. The first kind of agent is agents that embody like a corporate or a public function. So there's an Estonian company called Pactum, and they do automated procurement negotiations. And so the idea is that they've set up an environment where like both parties to the negotiation, like it will sort of model what are their interests, and then it will have them find an optimal outcome for both sides. And you can start thinking of all sorts of public functions that could be done by an AI agent. It could be things like detecting corruption or non-discrimination. It could be conducting public procurements, where you can get, it's not just a question of faster and cheaper, but like different level of quality, a qualitative difference in the outcomes. The whole theory that Pactum has is that most negotiations between two companies are Pareto non-optimal. They leave a lot of value on the table for both parties because these are complex negotiations. It's not just price. It's not like, let's pay more or less. It's like, what's the deadline? You know, what are the conditions if I fail the contract? There's a lot of complexity there, and the AI can look at that complexity much more holistically than any human negotiator could. So one is like, you know, agents doing functions for the government. The other thing is agents on behalf of individuals. You know, this is going beyond, I don't know, personalized services. This is an AI somehow looking at a lot of data about me, on my genetic profile, recent health problems I've had, environmental stuff, you know, some kind of cancers that might depend on your exposure to certain factors, and saying, hey, you really need a mammogram, and by the way, I'm not just going to nudge you, I'm just going to go book you the mammogram for next week and let you know about it. Now, if the government does that for me, there's a whole lot of ethical problems. We don't have to assume it's the government doing it for me. This may very well be that every individual has an AI agent working on their behalf, and the job of government is just to interface with that and help the AI agent work. And we talked about cultural stuff. A lot of difficulties in how organization works. It's translation between different paradigms. Between, you know, computer code and law, technology and business, data and analysis. We know that AI is very good at literal translation between languages. Can it also translate between paradigms, between ways of thinking? Maybe. That's what a lot of people are thinking about right now. There's no easy answer yet. There's a bunch of other stuff here. I think one of the cool things is like how we do regulation and compliance can work, can change. We can talk about that in the Q&A. State capacity is going to have to sort of evolve because it's like, how well do we interact with the AI in this world that's AI-based? And we shouldn't pretend this is all free. All this AI stuff, it's really expensive. These are like, just as a company, if you want to set something up, these are some of the costs. You know, for individual applications, we're talking millions of dollars. So this is something that a small government has to think about. And so I'm going to finish off with some very big open questions that no one has the answer to right now. The first is whether AI has a democratizing, decentralizing, or a centralizing function. Hard to say. You'll remember when, well, you may not remember, but when the internet came out in the 90s, everyone's like, oh my God, this is great. You know, equalizing, decentralizing, fast forward to the 2010s, and the entire internet's controlled by like 2 countries and like 8 major companies. So how's it going to go with AI? Second of all, are the cultures, the practices, and processes of the AI era, I didn't get to tell you why this cognitive era thing is a nice phrase, but that's not so important. The AI era, are they different to the internet era? Like, is all this soft stuff going to change? And finally, same thing we asked before, is success in AI adoption at the level of organizations and companies, is that independent or a dependent variable? Like at the end of the day, are the countries that like do all the really cool AI shit, are they just going to do the good AI shit because they're good at this anyways? Like Estonia and Denmark will adopt AI and get more benefit because they already were better governed, or is it going to be the case that actually there are countries out there that are today baseline, average, crappy, whatever, and because they do AI, they will have a jump in their capability beyond what their trajectory might otherwise be. I tend to think there will be countries like that, and the evidence I have, it's not quantitative, is like when I talk to some, not all, but some countries in Africa, their level of thinking right now around technology in government, around technology and AI, is at the same level as ours. And they're like doing really cool stuff. And they're doing that not to do nasty corrupt things, but for public goods provision. And obviously they have, the material base is very different in Nigeria or Ghana than it is in Estonia or in Denmark. But there are some things where I wouldn't say the governance outcomes will be worse. So I have thrown a lot at you. I've only left 20 minutes for questions. I'm very sorry. But please, tear into me.